first higher education and human development research seminar for the year. We anticipate having 6 in total, spread through the year. And at this stage, it's very likely that they will continue to be done using an e-platform unless things change quite dramatically. So it's such a pleasure to welcome Rob. It was more or less this time last year. I think it was around. In fact, I think it was around this time last year that Rob was going to come to the Free State and do the seminar and do a capacity building workshop. But by that point, COVID had Cape Town in its grip. And it was starting to spread through the country, and it looked as if this probably wouldn't be a great idea. So we've kind of waited 12 months to see if there would be an opportunity for Rob to actually come to UFS. That's not really been possible, but we do hope at some stage, Rob, that we will be able to welcome you to Bloemfontein in person. I asked Lucretia to circulate the link to the UCT news article, which was related to Rob's award of a Rhodes University 2020 Distinguished Alumni Award, just to give you some sense of who he is. And I'm going to go through a couple of points. So for those of you who haven't seen it, Rob is currently the director of UCT's New Generation of Academics program and the Next Generation Professoriate Initiative in the Office of the Vice Chancellor. So he has a major role in nurturing especially Black and female researchers, but generally early career researchers and mid-career researchers. I didn't know this. He started off by studying journalism at Rhodes in 1976 to 1978, and then he did an honours degree in history. I know he'd studied history, but I didn't know that he'd studied journalism. And he was active in student politics during his time at Rhodes. And the UCT article speaks quite movingly about the impact on Rob and his own thinking and his career path of the events of 1976. And of course, he makes that point about activism in one of the articles. And he speaks about the impact of what was going on in 1976 with the unrest around Soweto, and then 1977, the murder of Steve Biko. And he says, watching colleagues being detained and marched out of the Rhodes Library, he says, that was my awakening, and it shaped me, not just intellectually, but politically in a very profound way. And then his ex-colleague from Rhodes and a recently retired history professor, Paul Malem, speaks very highly of Rob, who's a B1 rated scholar by the NRF, by the way. And he says, as a scholar, Rob has been at the forefront of masculinity studies in South Africa and is indeed internationally known for this, adopting a truly interdisciplinary approach to the topic, publishing widely, and earning an international reputation for his work. And second, he merits the award for his work as an educationist because he spent some time as a professor of education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then I think very importantly, one of his colleagues says of him that Rob has been unafraid to speak truth to power, which is not the easiest thing to do in our universities. And he describes him as one of the most engaged academics that I know, with a rare ability to link sociological, historical, and legal writing. Rob plans to retire at the end of this year, and to get down to writing a historical book on the Durban anti-apartheid community of the 1980s and 1990s. And I, for one, look very forward to reading that someday. So, Rob, you're very, very welcome. I'm sure, like everybody else, we've really enjoyed engaging with the papers that you circulated and come with many questions. So I'm going to end just by referring to the piece that you had published in University World News in October 2019. Titled New Knowledge Economies Rising Against the Odds, which was referring to the book which you had jointly published with Fran Collier, Rowan Connell and Jao Meyer. And in this you said the questions that we need to ask are, how is knowledge produced, who produces it, who funds it, and who determines what is important? And I think those are 4 quite helpful questions to bear in mind as we listen to you today, and then as we engage with you around your work. So you're welcome, and it's over to you.
Thanks very, very much, Melanie, and good afternoon, everybody. That's a lovely introduction, Melanie. Thank you. I wish I were in Bloemfontein, or maybe I don't wish I was in Bloemfontein per se, but I wish I was with you face to face to be able to see you all and engage, but hopefully that time is not too far off when the vaccines begin to grip and promised herd immunity begins to take effect. Anyway, here we are today, and I was saying to my wife just a moment ago that it's quite difficult to cram sort of 10 years of research and a book and many articles into 35 or 40 minutes. You know, the problem really is condensing that stuff and making it accessible. But I've had, as Melanie points out, a lot of time to think about this. And I've got a 12-slide PowerPoint to help me along. Ordinarily I would say, but I'll say in a face-to-face context, but I'll say it now as well, that I prefer a fairly informal approach. So people tell me that I'm prone to anecdotes and drifting sideways. Please excuse that. Normally there is some purpose in my deviations. I hope you'll be able in the course of the next while to see what that purpose is. So this title firstly is a sort of hold-all title for today's session. Kind of has got the main keywords in it. This is the book cover of the book. It's Wits University Press, and I show it not so much in the hope that you'll buy it, but to go to the next slide, which also has a tree, but this is the Monash University Publishing cover. And actually, to be true to my drifting sideways, there's something interesting about this, that because Raewyn Connell, about whom I shall talk in a moment, is a major figure in publishing and in academia, and resides in Sydney, we were able to get a book contract with Monash Publishing, which I think Monash has many campuses around the world, including, until recently, or maybe still, in South Africa. I think Monash is in Melbourne originally, but as I say, they're all over the place. So Monash offered us a contract to publish this book, and we could not get any of the major publishers to follow suit. Why is that important? Oh, it's very interesting to see that this particular cover spells my name wrong. I remember seeing that the first time round. It's important because, you know, who publishes your work makes quite a big difference in what impact it has. And Monash do not distribute at all well. They don't have a marketing arm, or one that makes much sense, and they don't do a very energetic job of getting their own books reviewed. So we were then able, if I'll just take you back to this one, to get Wits University Press to get a contract for the distribution and publication rights in Africa, which is very important, I think, for those of us who live in South Africa, because the Monash Press version is actually, even though it's soft cover, is actually expensive. So we've got these two versions of the same book. They differ basically in their cover, and I think the second round did get my name spelled correctly. So that's just a small story about, I guess, the politics of publishing. So the book got published, and we were very pleased that it did. It took quite a while to get out. It's quite a modest book, and here are the authors in our final meeting in Sydney, or as the Australians like to say, Sydney. On the extreme left is Raewyn Connell, then João Maia from Brazil, then next to him is Fran Collier, the lead author, at least by author order of the book, then me, then my UCT colleague, Vanessa Watson, who is an urban planner, and Rebecca Pierce, who was Raewyn's postdoc, who helped write some of the articles that came from our research. That is her house in Annandale, which is one of the southern suburbs of Sydney. Raewyn is actually moved out, sold that house in which she lived for 30 years and has moved into a much smaller place. So her health is not great any longer. But I stayed in that house quite a few times. So that's the team. I said I was going to say something about Raewyn, and let me do that now. So Raewyn first wrote a book in 1970 or something like that, a very, very long time ago. 1967, I think, a book on Australian politics. Raewyn's father was the professor of education in the University of Sydney. And these genealogies are quite interesting when one thinks about how academics are made, where they come from, what gives them a particular angle. So Raewyn grew up in a learned family with a scholarly father and never stopped reading, and still hasn't stopped reading or writing. Is prodigious. I don't know how many books she's written, but it's likely to be over 20, and most of them are self-authored. And they span this huge spectrum from political economy, knowledge production, but she's best known for her gender stuff. I got to know Raewyn's work through her very famous book, Gender and Power, which came out in 1987, and then her later book, Masculinities, which came out in 1995. But prior to that, she'd written a lot of stuff, including a book called Which Way is Up, which is interesting because it does question issues of normality and is at the heart of the concern of her concept, hegemonic masculinity. I could say more about Raewyn. Suffice to say for now that when I was speaking about my work at a public venue in Cape Town at a book festival, somebody in the audience objected to the fact that I drew attention to Raewyn's journey from being a man to a woman, and it was some kind of woke moment. So I'm a little bit more cautious now, but I've known Raewyn since 1992 when I first met her, and I consider her a close friend. Okay, so here now we get on to the guts of this book. So here are some introductory slides. This is Peter's projection cartography, map of the world, and this maps land space. If you're familiar with Mercator's projection, which is the one normally used, you'll see that Europe is generally presented as the same size as Africa, or even sometimes larger. You will see in fact that Africa is enormous, and that this imagination of geography lies at the heart of Southern theory, which is that this presentation of the globe presents the North as huge and influential and the South as not very important. And if you start, excuse me, at this very simple level, you can begin to explore the implications of these imaginations, but also map them onto geopolitical realities. So here is the other oddity. So why is the Northern Hemisphere the North? You know, why shouldn't the South be the North? Because the North somehow in our imagination is privileged. And a lot of the work around Southern theory is exploring that privilege. It's naming it, to use Chakrabarty's term, it's provincializing Europe, to regard Europe not as the center, but rather as a province, as something smaller. And this approach, as I've already indicated, can be very fruitful in beginning, as Raywin did with gender, to ask the question, which way is up? Now we come to some of the results or the realities of an imperfect world, of an unbalanced world, of a world where geography actually does matter. This is an old map that I hope you can see. It's not a map, it's a, what is this? It's a graph, or not a graph, it's table, illustration, whatever. So I'll draw your attention to the yellow little circle at the bottom of the middle of your screen above the ITIES of top 400 universities, and those are the only 3 sub-Saharan universities that make it into the world's top 400 universities. And I think in 2013, 2014, that was UCT, WITS, and Pretoria universities. If you look then at London, you will see that the City of London has 4 times that number, just the City of London. And if you look at Boston, it's powerful in that regard as well, and you just look at the distribution, you will see how very unequally are the resources at higher education level distributed through the world. So we've got on the left hand of your screen where you've got the US, Boston, New York, and Baltimore just be the main city producers of knowledge. Then you've got Europe with the Paris, Brussels, London, Amsterdam, and the West Midlands. I guess that would be Birmingham and Coventry and places like that. Manchester, Liverpool. Melanie, you must be chortling at my lack of familiarity with the West Midlands. But anyway, you can see that those 2 groupings massively dominate world production of higher education expertise as understood in the rankings of universities. And there's a lot to say about the ranking system and so forth, but I'm just trying to give you some sense of what these inequalities look like. Here is a map of the world that uses the Web of Science and to show, well, as you can see, global publishing by author location. And you can again see how very small and narrow and emaciated Africa is compared to the rather, is this incorrect, obese United States, and hugely inflated Europe. I mean, unrecognizable, it's so large. But this really is a demonstration of how knowledge production is consolidated in particular parts of the world. And in the course of this seminar, I hope we talk about the implications of this maldistribution. Now I'm going to talk about the book that I contributed to. And there's a lot to say, so let me just try and give you the big brush strokes. So Australia, Brazil, and South Africa are the biggest knowledge producers in their respective continents. So Australia, so let's call it Australasia. Australia is by far the biggest producer. Brazil, by far the biggest producer in South America, and South Africa, similarly in Africa. There have been reviews of the book that have questioned whether Australia should actually be considered a southern part of the global south. That is primarily because of the relative wealth of Australia. Its per capita wealth really places it in the top echelon of middle income, or even at the bottom of developed nation status for economists. And there is this debate about how we conceptualize the global south. You know, do you start at the equator and go south, or how do we do that? And quite a lot of, I think, justifiable criticism is that if one does this mechanistically or just geographically, it can produce not very helpful findings. What we tried to do is to look beyond geographical location at histories. So each of these countries has a long history of colonialism. Brazil, obviously, the longest, then South Africa, then Australia. And each of them had large settler populations. In Brazil, obviously, they've had 500 years of an integrative process. South Africa longer, Australia not very long. But nevertheless, the relationship of settler colonies to the metropole is quite distinct. It's different from the relations of metropolitan nations between one another. And it's different from colonies of extraction, where there were very small settler populations and the exports were simply taken out of the colonies. And of course, one of the worst examples of this is slavery, where human beings were the exports. But there were a lot of raw material extractive processes that were associated with imperialism and colonialism that lasted right through to the mid-20th century, and possibly, some would argue, to this day. So that's why we chose those three countries, or those three countries were chosen. So I looked at South Africa. João, who is obviously Portuguese speaking, was in charge of Brazil, and Raywin and Fran Collier did Australia. And what did we do? Well, we decided you couldn't do everything, so we decided to try and measure the state of knowledge production. Excuse me, but the rubbish truck has just arrived outside and is going to be loading up the dustbins, so you might have some competing noise. So we tried to think, how could we measure knowledge production? So what we did, this is Raywin. Raywin was the driver, the intellectual power of this project. She suggested these three knowledge domains, and they are distinguished by all being relatively new. So the first AIDS article was published in 1982. Climate change is associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that was established, I think, 1988, I think it was. So climate change doesn't really exist as a domain before 88, HIV before 82. Gender has a longer history, but in response to second wave feminism, there is a huge burgeoning of gender journals and gender interest from the late 70s onward. So basically, if one wants to use a sort of rough guide, all of these knowledge domains emerge in the 80s, and therefore the dominance of older universities in the north, it could be challenged, because these are issues that could be taken up by universities in the global south without the disadvantage of long history. So if you're the University of Bologna, started in 1580 something, you know, you've got a lot of time to establish yourself. Oxford, Cambridge, all of those universities have the advantage of history. But if there's a new issue that you want to discuss, well, everybody's invited to the table of research to do that. So that was the underpinning logic of those three knowledge domains. So in order to examine those three knowledge domains, we had different methodologies. So for each one, we interviewed domain researchers, which is to say we had a discussion of how do you identify who's the right person. Well, you can look on Google Scholar and see who's published a lot and who's cited the most. That's one way. You can, if you want to have a slightly more representative sample, you can be more purposive and do a snowballing and try and get a mixture of well-established and leading researchers with younger researchers to factor in race, location, gender, and so forth, age. And that's what we tried to do. We tried to interview people about climate change. You know, you've done this research. How did you do it? How did you decide what you would do? What were the obstacles in your way, and so forth? And we did that for each of the knowledge domains. Then the ethnography, we chose one institution in each country, and we, in my case, employed a postdoc, Ralph Borland, to locate himself in the Energy Research Center at UCT, which was a climate change research institute, to see how knowledge was made. So this is not talking to people so much, but to observe processes of knowledge production. Our hypothesis, if we had one, was that the way in which knowledge is produced in the global south is different from many places in the global north because there are big resource differences. We don't have figures, but my suggestion would be that support staff, oh, what's happened? Somebody's, I don't know what to do. I know what to do. Request control. What must I do here, Lucretia?
You can just go back to your slide. Click on your slide.
Okay, am I there? Can you see it?
Can't see the slide yet.
Really no. I can't see this. Hang on a moment. See, I'm looking at the team screen now, Lucretia, and I can see me, but that's not helpful. I can't see where my slide's gone. Any suggestions on, this is a new thing for me. Is there any, what must I do here?
You can re-upload, you can upload.
Okay.
There is an option.
Okay.
Just near your leave, there is an option to leave before the, just adjacent to that. There is an option to upload your slide content. Yes. Yeah,
it's working now. Let me just see. There, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Now I just have to. Is this right? I'm not quite sure how to make this big. Just go to slides. Where was I? I was here, I think. Where is it? That right? Can you see that, folks?
Yes, correct.
But it's small. Or is it the whole of your screen?
It's fine on my side.
Okay.
It's not, but it's quite readable, so it's fine.
Okay, let me continue.
Okay.
I was talking about the ethnography, and the hypothesis is that in well-resourced research institutions with lots of admin staff, a lot of money for technical staff, for data processing and so forth, and for systems, you would have a very different labor process from one where the resources are not so lavish, both human and other, technological. So we wanted to examine that. And then the third part of the study was to look at the bibliometrics, to analyze the Web of Science data, where you would get a volumetric quantitative analysis of these three knowledge domains. And I'll show you some of the results of that very shortly. You'll see that we did quite a lot of interviews. Admit, I'm just going to. We did quite a lot of interviews, and the distribution was pretty even, I'd say. Because one of the knowledge domains was gender, there was a particular sensitivity to the distribution of men and women. And from my side, I think it worked well. The three institutions, you can see there was the Energy Research Center at UCT, the AIDS Center, which was a research lab in Rio, and a gender unit, which they wanted to anonymize. So it's just called Gender Unit. By the way, I did write with Vanessa Watson and Ralph Borland an article on the ethnography, and it was quite an interesting discussion about whether to talk directly about the Energy Research Center as institution or to anonymize. And for me, it didn't make much sense to anonymize. In a small country like South Africa, you could figure it out quite quickly. But actually, the detail of the personnel and the location of the university add a lot to the understanding of how things work as they do. So where possible, I favor naming things, although the ethical research bureaucracies increasingly are cautious about that. Yes, that's a note and a discussion for another day. The bibliometric analysis, you'll see these numbers here are the number of articles found on Web of Science between 1980 and 2015. So climate change 22,000, HIV and AIDS 13,000, gender 26,000, reflecting the fact, I think, in the case of gender, that its roots were somewhat older, so that there were many more publications in 1980 for gender. There were none for HIV, and I think 3 or 4 for climate change. So yeah, let me move on to the next slide. Now what's going to how do I do this? No, sorry, it's not moving on screen and responding to. Okay, I can go here. Wait a bit. Wait. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for the help. Somebody took control. That's fantastic. Okay, here is the outcome. It's gone again. Can you see?
No, we are not able to see.
We've lost the slides again.
I don't know what is going on. I'm going to try and upload again. Okay, I've got it here. Just hang on a moment. Is this the one?
That's correct.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. This is very interesting, because if you're thinking of these three countries as in the global south and suffering various disadvantages, which we can talk about, what is confounding is that, in fact, these three countries feature in the top 25 in all of these domains. In fact, you'll see that Australia is in the top 5 of climate change, and South Africa is in the top 3 of HIV, and Australia also in the top 5 of sex and gender. So there's a lot to be said about this, a great deal, but the advantage of being located in the south needs to be set against the disadvantages that accrue from being on what we used to be called the periphery. This suggests a much more dynamic and contested state of affairs in the world. Brazil appears in the middle of these tables, and it suffers the enormous disadvantage of many of its researchers being primarily Portuguese speaking and writing in Portuguese, and the outlets for Portuguese speaking material are very limited globally. So the fact that they appear at all is really amazing. So that it's a large, it's got 120 million people. It's a very large economy with a lot of universities and fairly large state commitment at federal and at provincial and federal level for the university system. South Africa features in all the lists, but not very prominently in climate change and gender. But the fact that South Africa is in the top 3 is very significant. And that speaks a great deal about the importance of activism, the importance of engagement, and indeed the extent of a crisis that a country is facing. So South Africa's particular investment in AIDS research comes from the fact that we had a president who for a long period of time refused to permit the rollout of antiretrovirals and contested the scientific basis of HIV and AIDS. So that animated and mobilized researchers in South Africa across a very, very broad spectrum. The medics, but then the medics were the virologists, the physicians, the people, the clinicians. So you've got a lot of different kinds of research happening in South Africa, all attempting to address a national calamity, people dying, and some would say needlessly. I think the most quoted figure is something like 300,000 people died at a time when the rollout of antiretrovirals would have saved them. So and you might advance the same explanation for climate change in Australia, which has a very serious heat problem, which is put down to climate change. So you've got a lot of dedicated research funding directed at climate change. Now I'm going to try and get to the next slide. That's no good. Okay, this is the last slide. So what do we, can you see it? Hope so.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So what I haven't shown you, other than in the maps, is that the global north is incredibly dominant. If you agglomerate it and you talk about it as one thing, it's an enormously powerful industry with huge numbers of staff, publication rates, funding, and so forth. And there's not been very much change when you look at the picture in those terms. The one big exception, and I am not aware of any research that has done definitive work on this, is China. Chinese universities are rapidly rising in the global rankings, as is their share of publishing. So that would be the one caveat. But in terms of the work that we discussed in this book, this picture remains true. A second factor is that most of the submissions are from the global authors in the global north. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but quite a lot of journals and journal editors are now actually aware that this is a problem and are trying to institute practices and develop policies to increase the share of publishing from authors in the global south. I think that's it's an important recognition that we need to acknowledge that things are dynamic, that the politics is not unidirectional, and that many journals, I think more so in the soft sciences and the hard sciences, are aware that not just in the global south, but people who are not in English first language speaking countries are at a decided disadvantage, and which is not to say that they have nothing to say, it's just to say that the outlets for their work are not many, and this produces a skew. Most PIs, principal investigators, are based in the global north because most big grants come from the global north. So the National Institute of Health, one of the biggest funders of medical research in the world, has been notoriously chauvinistic, is that the wrong word, by insisting that PIs be based in American universities. But it is changing. Now there is a much greater willingness to have co-PIs, in other words, principal investigators based in both arms of a project, and this opens up the debate about the distribution of resources within a grant. So historically, most of a grant goes to actually the funded institution, which is generally global north. So you get a large grant and a bit of it trickles to the global south where the work is done. That is now being contested in all manner of ways. It's a complex issue. So let me come to the next one. The global south does, as I've just demonstrated, have a strong presence in certain areas, and I think that's a very positive sign. We haven't done any more research to show if that's sustained, but I can't see why it wouldn't be sustained. The one reason, which we can get to, is of the funding of universities in the global south. In discussion time, I do want to refer to a big report produced by Johan Mouton and Crest that looks at the funding of universities. And basically, national governments in the global south underfund their own universities, in some instances to a chronic degree. So I guess another way of putting it, we need to put our own house in order. It doesn't help only to look at the global north as though they are the author of all our misfortune and difficulty. In fact, quite a lot of the problems in the global south emanate from the global south, and that's an enormous area of discussion, from government support to the idea of the function of a university in the global south. Is it for knowledge production? Is it an applied institution to resolve development issues? Or is it just a place to promote elite class formation? So there are, as I say, big debates there about how the geopolitics of knowledge has an endogamous and an exogenous aspect. The final point I think I've already made, which is that as southern workforces grow and mature, they are in a stronger position to contest things. My interviews in the AIDS area was very interesting. So UCT has a very strong health faculty, and currently the outgoing president of the International AIDS Society is actually a UCT staff member. And as a result, UCT researchers are able to vigorously contest, not just to contest, but often to win debates about the terms of research. So it's not as though Southern researchers now are perpetually going to be disadvantaged in this way, that it is possible to have what I'm going to call a more democratic dispensation around how knowledge is produced. Melanie, that is my last slide. I have no idea if I went chronically over time, but I see we've still got 40 minutes, so I think that's enough time to have questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Rob. To give people a bit of time to think about what they say, if it's okay, I want to make a couple of comments and maybe some questions. Not quite sure which is which. So thank you very much, and also for showing how complex and complicated these issues and debates on, that sometimes they presented in overly simplistic ways. So the comments I want, well, the first thing is a comment. So South Africa does very well relatively in publications on HIV and climate change, but I wondered to what extent that performance is carried a lot by natural scientists, where South Africa is historically much stronger than it is in the social sciences and the humanities, where the latter having been affected more seriously by the prolonged academic boycott. So and then it's interesting that in gender, which is much more social science-based research, we're very much weaker. So that's the one comment if you want to respond to that. The second thing, and this arises out of your complicating of the terrain and saying, you know, we can't just blame the global north for our woes and our problems, which I think is right, even though I still think they're mostly to blame. But there's the issue of the internal stratification in South Africa itself. So we obviously, you know, we work at a mid-ranked, well, those of us at the Free State, we work at a mid-ranked university in a place that nobody's heard of when you go outside of South Africa. And in our experience, these sort of big grant holders really want to work with UCT because they've heard of it. They really want to work with WITS because they've heard of it, and they have these very established reputations, and they're rather interesting places to visit. I mean, assuming that we'll be doing that again. And I suppose the same would hold for UKZN, but they show very little interest or being particularly proactive in wanting to work, say, with the University of the Free State. So unless you've got incredibly strong networks, you're going to be overlooked every time. And I don't think there's that sort of debate isn't going on as well, sort of internally. And then the third, and I'd be interested in your comments on that. And then the third comment arises from your, I think quite rightly identifying that in some areas anyway, and I think it's very uneven, researchers in the South or in South Africa are shifting the grounds of the debate. But in relation to that, I'm quite interested in how the debates around decoloniality and decolonization, which are now sort of popping up all over the place in northern contexts, may well work to deflect these southern concerns, because they appear to be, you know, we're all in it together, as it were, but we simply aren't all in it together. And then the final comment that I'll make, and a question for you to comment on, which is slightly different. In the paper which appears in International Sociology, the one with Raymond Fran and your Brazilian colleague, you talk about, you say that it's important to recognize and celebrate epistemological plurality. And I guess that's sitting underneath what you've been saying now. But then you write, yet in doing so, we risk falling into a mosaic epistemology that fragments rather than connects knowledge and political practice. I'd be interested if you could say a little bit more about that. I've got lots of other comments and questions, but I'll leave it there and then let others have a chance to step in. And if you want to ask a question, there's a facility to put up a hand, put up your hand, and I'll do the best I can to coordinate that discussion. So thanks very much. I'd be interested in any of your sort of comments on any of those or one of those, or however you want to do it.
May I attempt to address all of them?
Sure. Sure.
At the risk of going on and on and on.
Sure.
It's, first of all, your thing about social science and HIV/AIDS. It is very interesting. There's a broader issue, which is that, of course, it is an area where the medicos dominate. You know, there's a kind of hierarchy of knowledge, which always irks me, because I think that biomedical models dominate a lot of our university practices. So the curse of ethics clearance for me comes from medicine, and it's one of the legacies of the dominance, the hierarchy of knowledges within institutions. So first of all, it's correct that social science is a minor contributor to AIDS knowledges. That's the first thing. Secondly, Rebecca Hodes and I attempted to see if there was what we'd call a southern imprint on South Africa's contribution to the AIDS knowledge production, and we argue, I'd say mostly convincing, it's not bulletproof, that in fact South African contributions to that debate emphasized humanity much more than northern approaches. So the insertion of people into the AIDS research agenda can be found. We look at the top 10 articles on HIV in South Africa by Google Scholar, and almost all of them are driven to ask questions about what happens to the people rather than just looking at the disease. So I think that we could say that there has been, and I don't think it's a terribly surprising finding actually, if you think of how apartheid generated issues of you know, research expertise in trauma, reconciliation, you know, those kinds of things. There are contextual reasons for it. That was the one thing. The second thing was about the internal stratification and Free State forever lost on the fluctus, you know, forever going to be the neglected child. I think that's true, and I think if you look around the world, that's probably true wherever you look, that there will be universities that do good work but are in not very romantic or quite remote settings. I would say that you know, what is there to be done about it rather than simply accept it? I think the idea of research consortia is gaining ground. I think they're increasingly that partnerships between northern well-funded institutions and a group of universities rather than just one university is taking hold slowly. I mean, one shouldn't overestimate the complexity that this generates, so that you're trying to always, you know, engage different kinds of university administrations, which is always such a pain and a headache. So I'd say that there are ways around it. I mean, in South Africa, the internal stratification, you know, goes all the way down to, you know, the old homeland universities, the so-called Bantustan universities. And the NRF, as you possibly know, obliges the bigger universities to team up with other universities to share their expertise. So I think there's a recognition that it is a problem, and I think that there is something that can be done about it, but I don't think you can overcome the problem. I think the concentration of resources, expertise, in particularly attractive locations, which are easy to get to. You know, if you're a global traveler, to get to the University of Venda is a real hike. And, you know, you'd be going there if you were really interested in, you know, medicinal plants maybe, or archaeology. But there are not a lot of reasons to go to a few of these universities unless they've got sort of centers of excellence. And I know that the NRF has tried to do that as well. So I think those are, you know, there's some isness about the global and national higher education sector that I think one just has to accept that these are parameters, they're realities, and one has to try and work with them. I should say, just as a last point about this, is ARUA, the Association of Research Universities of Africa. I'm not sure if people have heard of this. It was established about 6 years ago. You know, has tried to address this continentally, but it's interesting what they've done. They've gone to the big universities, to Makerere, University of Ghana, University of Dar es Salaam, I forget, there are about 5 of them. And the idea is that funders will try and promote these as research hubs in their particular regions. And therefore, if I could just say that it's, you know, I think one of the sadnesses of knowledge production in Africa is the history of universities in Africa. You know, that they became part of nationalist projects, which are not knowledge projects. They were political projects for the most part, and they were run down. And I think it's very, very difficult to build something up. Makerere has now been the object of foreign funding, attention, and support for quite some time. But then you think of the national environment in which academics are working there. You know, you've got a very authoritarian, intolerant government, you know, that is at war with, you know, the people trying to be parliamentary opponents. And it takes a lot to make a university work optimally. So, you know, I do think that again, the national context, not just the education context, are important in understanding why some universities fly and some actually just never take off. The 2 other points that you mentioned were the issue of decoloniality, the current moment in Southern theory. Yes, I do think that has a danger of eclipsing the geopolitical element. I mean, it's always only a slight irony that a lot of these projects are taken up most avidly in the north. Which I think is what you were hinting at. So I think that is a danger. But let me just say one other thing about this, which ordinarily I talk about at some length, which is one of the philosophers that Raywin found, and Raywin found, not me or anybody else, was the Benin philosopher Paulin Hutonji, who is from, as I say, from Benin, from West Africa, who wrote about knowledge production in Africa and developed this concept extroversion. If you don't know what extroversion is, just very briefly, it's like primitive accumulation of knowledge, that you go in, you extract the raw material, you send it back to the metropole where it gets refined and basically developed for consumption in the metropole. So there's no developmental cycle, it's an extractive cycle. And Hutonji is more sophisticated than that. But one of his critiques of research in Africa was that often, you know, the principal investigator would come from London or New York or Chicago, whatever, Berlin, and get research assistants, get them to collect data, and then write a book and publish it in Cambridge University Press, and the book never circulates amongst the people from whom the knowledge was taken, and it would never be used for the purposes of some kind of developmental, or not such an easy word, empowerment project. So that's the idea of extroversion, and the idea of Southern theory is to recognize that that's a danger and to put in place processes and personnel to ensure that knowledge is used for local benefit. And that comes to the mosaic question, Melanie. So one of the difficulties of Southern theory is what qualifies as Southern theory. So if you've got, let's go back to the AIDS debate in South Africa and the AIDS denialists, you've got Thabo Mbeki saying that this science is northern science, it's not right. And here in South Africa, we know better. Now here you've got a kind of separatist claim to knowledge, which can produce, there can be many claimants on truth or for truth. And it can produce, just a lot of diversity and actually not a lot of development or much value. And so that's that particular point. So there's always this tension, you want to to accept the importance of locality and different traditions of knowledge and understandings of knowledge, while at the same time not hiving off and claiming that you're not part actually of a global world, you're not part of, you know, humanity, that you've got your very own ways of doing things and nothing else matters. So that's a constant tension. And Raywin's book Southern Theory actually starts early on with a debate between a Nigerian sociologist and some other sociologist about what counts as sociology and what you can count, and it goes to the indigenous knowledge conundrum. So we want obviously to valorize indigenous ways of knowing without arguing necessarily that they're the whole truth or even part of the truth. Sometimes their value may not be where the people who espouse it understand it to be, but it's a very complex debate. That was more than an answer.
Thanks very much. I've got questions from Monique and Tanashi. Can I suggest that you both ask your questions? So Monique first and then Tanashi, and then Rob will respond to each of you in turn. So Monique, it's over to you first. Don't forget to unmute your mic, please. Monique?
Yes, actually, he already answered the question I had. That's why I lowered my hand. I was wondering regarding the extroversion that he brought up about who comes in and gets does the knowledge production and takes it away. So he pretty much addressed that already. Thank you.
Thanks, Monique. I've got to learn about this hands going up, hands going down. I ought to remember this from school, of course. Tanashi, do you still want to ask your question?
Well, yeah, I suppose in a way he did answer it, but hopefully it will be a slightly different question. I think Professor Morrell really addressed the question of issues such as extroversion and the politics of knowledge production. But I wonder to what extent we can speak about how these dynamics play out in a local context. I don't know if you know, Prof, I shared with Ian a couple of weeks ago an article in which I'm writing a rebuttal to another academic in South Africa about what economics constitutes and what it should be in South Africa, but also how economists are trying to sort of take over the discipline of economic history by arguing that the methods we use are not sufficient enough because we don't use numbers enough. So there's that debate going on at a local level. But to what extent are academics at a local level using discourses that they're borrowing from the West without really looking at them and bringing them down to a context where they create debates within the South African setting? So I wondered if Professor Morrell could speak to that. I hope that question is clear.
Should I
Yep, go straight on. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Tinashe. And thank you, Monique, for, I think it was Monique who made those comments. Let me come sideways at some of these questions. A long time ago, Melanie will possibly remember this article. Martin Legassic wrote a piece in the Palmer and Parsons book, which spoke about South Africa being a sub-metropole. And it was talking in those days about military aggression against neighbors, but the concept can equally be used in sub-Saharan Africa, that South African academics are massively more advantaged compared to colleagues working in neighboring countries, hugely. I've been to universities in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Swaziland, Swatini, and Zambia. And it really is very, very striking to see just in infrastructural terms the differences, and to know that in most of those countries, academics are very poorly paid, often requiring them to do 2 or 3 jobs at the same time, and there is very little support for research as we're talking about it now. So that there are a lot of difficulties, not least being, to use this phrase very lightly, at the mercy of South African partners, who then take on the role in a way of the more powerful northern partner, because the resources are here, the mobility, all of the stuff that people don't have, you know, is mirrored in these relationships. What's to say about that, other than, you know, we should be reaching out, we should be trying to produce partnerships, we should try and produce democratic relationships in the research place, so that one doesn't convert one's material power into knowledge inequality. I think for me that's the key to things. How do we do that? Well, we do it in our personal practice primarily. Institutions, I think, are very bad at this. The institutional imperatives are to maximize your advantage and to use it to dominate less well-endowed institutions. That's my own experience of UCT and other universities. But individual researchers have a huge capacity to support junior staff members, to create teams, to identify excellent undergraduate students and to nurture them up into postgraduate, to capacitate, and in that way to constantly build in a vision of knowledge sharing as a contribution to the public weal, to use an old term, but to humanity, to ensure that this is not a commodified process, that individuals who have the commodities can cash in on them and can use those for personal advancement. Our task has to be at least twofold. Of course, there are careers, but there are also the careers of people around us, kind of succession planning, and to address knowledge inequality. So I think that the structural elements are there, but I think we can, each of us, do something about them. My own little mantra is adopt, adapt, and then change the agenda. So this is in response to the question about economics and not using enough sort of quantitative methodology. Of course, that's true of certain journals, that they won't publish stuff that doesn't have enough numbers. But there is a contestation over methods. There's a very, very interesting piece in about 4 years ago, and it was either in Science or Nature, by two Egyptian academics who were talking about impact. And they're saying bibliometrics is fine, but what about policy impact? What about if we develop methodologies of how many people's lives we saved because we distributed water more efficiently through irrigation, because we had vaccination rollouts that were better, because our nutrition concerns were fed into public health? Now, bibliometrics doesn't measure that. And I think, you know, each of us in our own way has questions to ask themselves about what they are doing, but also there's this invitation to impact how we appreciate knowledge, how we disseminate knowledge. So I feel, you know, that we shouldn't cut ourselves off from brilliance of other people elsewhere in the world, whether they, you know, in Los Angeles or whether they're in, I don't know, Rio de Janeiro. We should adopt their stuff, but we should use it in ways that make sense to us, and we should join these processes in how we construct our agendas. So what's called a Metoo approach to research, where you simply replicate experiments done elsewhere. I mean, I don't think that's personally a very good thing to do. But to take a piece of research that's been done somewhere in, I don't know, Northwest Territories in the frozen north of Canada amongst indigenous peoples, and to think about how we could use those amongst the Kgalagadi populations of Botswana, I think that's, you know, that's a very useful thing to do. So that, you know, the transport of ideas and the way we transfuse ideas, I think, is an opportunity that should lead us to look beyond the parochial and to borrow freely but not slavishly. Wanted to say one quick other thing, Melanie, sorry to go on like this, but the knowledge inequalities are also in effect, I'm returning to the issue of numbers. In the age of big data, which is a very big thing in certain disciplines, where you assemble enormous databases, millions and millions of, what do you call data, large amounts. The computers that you need for that and the expertise even to maintain those databases, it can only happen in certain places in the world. It's the same with particle accelerators. You can only have 2 or 3 of those in the world because they are so expensive, and the people who service the equipment, have to be at a very, very high level. And I make this point because there is a contest over the assemblage of big databases and who has access to that knowledge. So, for example, my wife works in malaria, and they have most of the malaria is in the global south. Most of the big databases are held in the global north, but they contain knowledge and information from the global south. Now, the question is, who is controlling and using that data? And part of their effort to democratize and disseminate and give control over the data was to investigate having locations in Africa, for example. Africa has the biggest malaria burden of the world. Hundreds of thousands of people die each year. I think it's hundreds of thousands. It's a sustainable development goal to eradicate malaria. And when you begin to look not just at the infrastructure, but at the need for 10s, 20s, and 30s of technicians with very high-end level skills in a very, very competitive area, it becomes almost impossible to conceive of that. So, here we've got another example, SKA, the Square Kilometer Array telescopes. It has brought an enormous influx of expertise into South Africa, physics and maths. Would it be possible to do that without being part of a global network funded incredibly generously by global donors? The answer is absolutely not. So that you could only achieve that by having a particular nexus of local, regional, and international forces that produce that kind of concentration. So I don't know, I think it's very exciting to think of these questions and what we can do about them, because I don't feel powerless. I'm actually quite optimistic, even while I recognize the constraints.
Thanks very much, Rob. We've got 2 questions, one from Laksh and one from Oliver. So I suggest we take both of them. They might be all we've got time for. So Laksh, do you want to
yes, Prof.
Give your question, and then Oliver, if you can give yours. Oliver, don't forget to unmute your mic before you ask your question. Okay, Laksh, then Oliver, and then Rob will respond.
Okay, thank you, Prof. This is indeed a great discussion. My postdoctoral work is something related to these areas only. So greetings from Delhi. I have 2 questions. One is, I really like the presentation very much. One is, since the very ideal of social science, in my opinion, is Eurocentric in nature, I'm curious to know your definition of knowledge, actually. That is the first part of the question. Second is, publication as a criterion of knowledge production may be a concern, because I feel that this could be due to the neoliberal trends of the academic capitalism, which Sheila Slaughter and others are writing. So what could be your take on it? Thank you.
Thanks, Laksh. Do you want to ask your question, Oliver?
Yeah, thanks, Prof. Thank you very much, Prof, for your presentation. If I get you right, you take the increased number of publications on HIV in South Africa is something that is positive. But isn't the content of these publications more important than the number of publications? Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Let me come to your question first, very good question. I'm not sure it's more or less important, you know, and it goes to Laksha's question as well, which is could be phrases, what is knowledge for? So with the knowledge of HIV and AIDS produced in South Africa, we've had really dramatic effects, political effects, and effects on people. We have the largest number of people in the world receiving antiretroviral treatment. I mean, it's an astonishing achievement in a country that is marked by, you know, bureaucratic bungling on an extraordinary level. The fact that we have millions of people, I think it's 4 million, who are receiving antiretroviral treatments, which has huge implications for the length of their lives and the quality of their lives, is for me, you know, that's the ultimate vindication of research. But I would add that look at what the longer term implication is. We in South Africa are now at the forefront of COVID research. And why is that? Because we've got some of the best virologists in the world because they cut their teeth on HIV. So we have developed expertise in an area generated by chronic, unbelievable misfortune and tragedy, that knowledge has been produced out of this tragedy that is now at the service of its people and in fact of the whole world. You know, that the South African mutation of COVID was found here by our scientists, not by somebody else. It's incredible, you know, and I don't think, you know, we really do appreciate these kinds of things enough, because I think that you can look at South African knowledge production, not in all areas. I think our record of producing arms is not quite as honorable as it is in this medical field, but I do think that the case of HIV, not just in terms of publication numbers, but in terms of how it's impacted the health of the citizenry, has been exemplary. And of course, it's not just an accident that Abdul Slim Karim, the government spokesperson on the COVID advisory committee, you know, is one of the most prominent of South Africa's scientists, and he's, you know, an AIDS researcher. So that would be my answer there. Around the definition of knowledge, actually, I think I've kind of answered that as well. I'm not a great one for definitions. I think definitions, of course, you need them, but often I think when one gets into very detailed discussion of definitions, I'm not a philosopher, so maybe that's why I shy clear of it. But for me, the question about what is knowledge for is a very, very important question. And to go back to my answer about the mosaic approach to knowledge, I think is important there. So to move the discussion, or to go to an area that I know a bit about, because my primary area of research has been gender research, issues around homosexuality in Africa have frequently been inflected by claims about it is not our custom, it's not our practice, it is not our culture, as ways of launching homophobic attacks on sections of the population. Now, you can hear from my tone that I'm not really in favor of that use of a claim about knowledge, that knowledge can be defended in against claims that it's not authentic, and against claims that it's an unjust form of knowing, or that it produces injustices. So I think that we should always have the obligation to question what we are doing research on, as well as question what the result of that inquiry will be, and hopefully be driven by a desire to contribute to issues of humanity, not just narrow sectional or sectoral interests, or national interests for that matter. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our last two questions from Nelson first, and then from Mikiteko, and then we'll have to close. So Nelson, if you want to go first, and then Mikiteko, please don't forget to unmute your mics before you ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening to the presentation. My question is very quick. I'm just curious in terms of knowledge production and who is actually involved in the knowledge production. We know, I think, due to globalization and a lot of demographic shifts, the people who are working in different universities right now don't necessarily come from the very places where the universities are located. A good example is South Africa, where now I think in the universities, there's a lot of people from other countries. So when you're speaking about knowledge production, who is involved in that process? And then the questions that I think actually I also wanted to add to that one is the issue of gender. What divides do you see between the nature of knowledge production when it comes to the understanding of gender? I think you began to touch on that with the idea of how we understand homosexuality in Africa, but I was just curious to see how do you put those things together? Thank you.
My question draws from the conclusions that you made in your 2016 paper about how South African feminists are sort of paving the road to social theory that will have a positive impact on social sciences in terms of helping it to serve democratic purposes. I wondered, given the centrality of race in research and analyses about inequalities and social injustice in South Africa, do you think that South African scholars are paving a new path for social theory in a similar way, for example, that in the US scholars and activists have done with critical race theory? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I didn't catch the names that time, but thank you both for your questions. Let me the question about critical race theory and South African theorists, are they following in the steps of what I'm going to call the anti-apartheid activists? I really couldn't say, but let me not just duck it and let me try and offer an answer. I think that since 2015, if we start with Roads Must Fall, where a lot of stuff has been written about the curriculum, decolonizing universities, its practices, namings, and so forth. My own sense of that is that actually a lot of those debates happened like 50 years ago, which sounds very ageist, but they were part of the decolonizing moment in Africa from the 60s onward, including the curriculum. So for me, is there a lot of new stuff going on around critical race theory and curriculum in the North and in the South? I'm not sure. It's not my area of expertise. I think there's a lot of energy, but I'm not sure that it's terribly new. So it's a difficult question. I was when I was asked this question in an interview, I said, well, when I was at Rhodes in the 1970s, the age of Anne was replaced by the Chimurenga, which was the history of the Shona Ndebele risings of 1896-97. So for me, that was a decolonizing moment, but it's a long time ago. So I think maybe the comparison's not quite right. You know, maybe I'm unable to see what is particularly new about the emphasis of critical race theory, which is also an echo of the Black Panther movements of the 60s and the 70s. So for me, there's an echo here rather than something new. There's no doubt that this is energizing people. For me, the stuff that's I find really difficult to think about, and there's a lot of it in Australasia, is the importation of indigenous knowledge systems into evaluating what is knowledge. Sorry, let me switch that. So sorry, I got a bit. Let me come to the other question about gender and universities and who works at universities. So I think that it's very helpful for universities to draw from different populations. And in South Africa, we are very, very fortunate. A lot of people still want to come to South African universities. I notice it particularly with Zimbabwean colleagues. I work amongst many Zimbabweans at UCT. And I think there are two things to say about that. The one is that, of course, this is a really excellent thing. Is there a downside? Well, there's a downside, I think, for a country that's losing its best academics to institutions elsewhere if they never return. A colleague in Mozambique, he works in Cape Town, he was said, you're part of the brain drain. You've abandoned your homeland. He said, no, it's a matter of circular migration. So I think it's very interesting that, if you live elsewhere and you come to work in another country, do you take your skills back with you and use them to produce new networks, or do you cut away altogether and then you're effectively a loss? So, these debates, I think, are very important debates. In South Africa, one of the debates is, why should we be spending a lot of money on training doctors if they immigrate? Because they take their skills with them. There's no benefit to the country. If you train a doctor and he or she leaves, that's an absolute loss to the fiscus and to the national skills base. So I think these are they're interesting questions, and I wish we would engage them, more robustly and more openly, because I think they have implications for research. And insofar as you asked me about the gender, do women bring something particular to the gender enterprise? It's like a landmine, isn't it? It doesn't really matter what you do. Once you stand on that, something is going to go off. I think I have to go back to my statement about universities and research processes benefit when we've got different inputs. So long as if you've got uniformity and everybody's thinking the same thing, then I don't think you're likely to make really interesting knowledge. If you've got different questions being asked and people who are receiving those questions using their own experiences and training from different places to input, I think your chances are better of having a really useful knowledge produced. I can't really say more than that. I've generally, because I've been in education, most of my colleagues have been women. So, I've enjoyed that. It's not been a yes or a no, it's an and kind of story. So I suspect there are many layers of questions in this last batch that I've missed. Sorry about that. I see it's 2:03 and we are out of time. Sorry to go on, Melanie.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks for spending so much time with us. I think if I'd understood Mekateko correctly, in a way she was asking, do we need somebody, in the way that you wrote making Southern theory on gender researchers, if we need somebody to write about making Southern theory and looking specifically at researchers on race who are based in South Africa, which I think would be quite an interesting thing to do. So thanks very much for your time. It's definitely not the end of the conversation. We remain hopeful that we will be able to meet up with you at the University of the Free State sometime in the next 12 months. And thank you for the readings. And we've recorded the session, so Lucretia, I guess, will post it on the YouTube channel or whatever. I'm not quite sure how these things work. And we can circulate Rob's slides afterwards as well if people would like them. So, I mean, normally we would give a big clap and say a very nice thank you and so on. So we're doing a very nice thank you, and I'm clapping for for everybody. And I see the little hands clapping, which is very nice.
Thanks very much.
So thanks very much, and yeah, we shall talk again and meet again hopefully.
Lovely.
And that concludes today's session. Reading group people, I'll be sending you a Google Meets link in the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, goodbye everybody.
Thanks,
Bye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.